Good morning, and welcome to another episode of Decomposing Messiaen, a series of videos studying the book by Olivier Messiaen called Techniques of My Musical Language. Today we're looking at chapter 6, which is polyrhythm and rhythmic pedals. I think the video is going to go sort of like this, right? We're going to take the first 15-20 minutes and talk about what Messiaen means by polyrhythm and how he constructs them out of the material that we've talked about in the previous chapters around non-retrogradable rhythms, augmentation, diminution, the categories of rhythmic processes. How do we construct polyrhythms out of that? And then what do we do with it? Why do that? Which sort of leads into the second section, which is a bit more of a tangential discussion around what do rhythmic patterns do musically to those of us who listen to them. Why construct these large, complicated rhythmic forms? What are they doing in the music? And Messiaen has some very specific ideas about that. And then towards the end of the video, I'm going to return to the practice etude that I've been working on in each of these different videos, where I try to apply the specific lesson from each chapter to a short piece that I've been working on. To date, that piece has been a melodic line. You can check out the other videos and you'll see how it's evolved from a single measure now into something that's, I don't know, roughly 20 or 30 measures long. But today we'll be adding a rhythmic counterpart to it. And then I'm going to play that, not on the piano, but on the melodica. And I'm going to try and do that in two parts using one of those groovy iOS applications like Acapella, where I play with myself. Before we dig in, though, I want to talk a bit about why I'm doing these videos. Remind myself why I'm doing these videos, because I sometimes get intimidated as I read through a lot of the material that's out there published about Messiaen. You know, I'm trying to put these videos in context, but I'm not an academically sophisticated speaker on music. I have academic training in the sense that I have degrees that I never finished, and I have some compositional experience in the sense that I have stacks of paper of music that I've never really finished. So my commentary on Messiaen is not well informed in that way. I've read a lot and I've thought about it a lot, but when I speak about it, what I'm really trying to do, and with these videos, is to look at the musical experience with Olivier Messiaen as a particularly wonderful exemplar of the musical experience, and understand how that experience overlays on my experience as a human. And then that's a generic experience because we're all human. So I'm interested in that shared experience of sound and body, whether it's Messiaen, whether it's another composer from that tradition, whether it's music from somewhere else on the world, planet, whether it's somewhere off the planet, whether it's unintended sound, like found field recordings. The experience of sound and the body is something that's, I think, very interesting, but very important as we understand what it is to be human, to be creatures that live and experience and then eventually die. And the musical study, and again, particularly the study of Messiaen, is a useful analogy for that, perhaps. Messiaen, because he will speak in terms of his music as deliberately trying to provoke a particular experience. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is really what the second part of the video was going to be about. But I've gotten some good feedback from people who've heard these videos, and a common thread is like, well, what are you trying to do with these videos? What am I trying to do? Am I trying to present a theoretical paper? Well, not really, although I do want to be able to present the musical examples in a coherent way. Is this a personal memoir? Not really, but I like to take those tangents. It's really that intersection that I'm interested in. And the phrase that comes to mind today, as I try to explain that, is extracting the aesthetic. So I like that, right? What is it in music or in poetry or in the visual arts, or, like I said, in other just experience of the world around us? What is it that brings forth the aesthetic, that extracts the aesthetic? What is that? What is that? What is the aesthetic? Is it the imagination? Is it what is it? And what does it mean to extract it and then to present it to be considered or to be beheld? How do you behold the poetry of life? And I'm thinking about this particularly because I had sort of an experience like this. You know, last weekend on a Saturday afternoon, I was sitting on the porch and I was listening to Messiaen on a little speaker, a little Bluetooth speaker out there on the porch. And it's noisy. We live on a major road, so there's a lot of noise, traffic noise, people noise. It's not deafening, but it's a constant counterpoint to the music. But it was wonderful. I had Au Canyon des Étoiles, From the Canyon to the Stars, which is a piece that I'd wanted to sit and listen to and think about. And I set aside the time on Saturday afternoon. And the Saturday afternoon time is important for me. For nearly 2 decades, at 3 o'clock on Saturdays, like clockwork, I would go visit a friend at his studio, and he would stop his painting. And we would sit down and pour ourselves some wild turkey bourbon, and we would smoke a pipe, and we would talk about different projects for the first hour or so. And then by then we'd be in our second or third drink, and we would start to listen to music, and we would start to talk very flights of fancy. I have journals and journals full of conversation notes, where the first page will be quite detailed project notes. We did work together. And then by the second or third page, it's just more like hieroglyphics and Venn diagrams with electromagnetism and the human body over here. Just interesting, unexpected alignments of different ideas. And we did listen to Messiaen together. Although, to be fair, we probably overall listened to Sibelius more than anything else. If I think about the piece that most captures those afternoons, it's the final movement of Sibelius' Fifth, because we'd put it on maybe in the third hour, and he had an old school record player, and we put the vinyl on, crank it up, and that third movement is just so rocket fuel, right? And so I would end up with my pipe waving around and my glass spilling, storming around, conducting in a very arbitrary fashion to Sibelius' Fifth. But we would listen and certainly considered Messiaen a lot. And my friend passed away a few months ago. And I want to get back into the practice of honoring that time. So it was very important that I do it then. And I haven't been honoring that time. And my excuse is this quarantine and change in the amount of time I spend at home anyway has just disrupted all of that. But the reality is it was just a lack of discipline. So today is a Saturday, and I intend to work on this recording now for the morning, and then at 3 o'clock go sit out on the porch. We're supposed to have thunderstorms today, and I have a pipe at the ready. This is my summer pipe. And I have some aromatic tobacco. My friend, we rarely smoked aromatic. We smoked a Turkish shag. Kind of like the kind of thing you'd expect Sherlock Holmes to smoke. And really you have to. If you're going to smoke a pipe with bourbon, it's got to be something that will hold up. What I have to smoke here is a very nice, light, aromatic tobacco. And I'll smoke that while I first start to drink the bourbon, and then I'll probably put the pipe aside, because in order for the pipe to sustain itself against the strength of the bourbon, I'd have to really over smoke it, and I'd end up burning my mouth. So that's what the study of music should bring, is the ability to have those spontaneous moments of overlap. I mean, I think in part it's what John Cage was looking for as well. It's a sliver of what Cage is talking about. Cage is talking about a broad and wonderful way of appreciating the mind as well. But I do remember, and I apologize for taking so long in this introduction before we're even talking about polyrhythms. So those of you who are eager to see the technical working out of polyrhythmic canons, just hold on a little bit longer. We're going to get there. But I remember a long time ago driving in a car in, it was somewhere near the ocean. It was probably Portland, Maine, and so it was probably 15 or 20 years ago. My wife and I were driving through Portland, and we had on the radio, listening to one of the local classical music stations, because this was before compact discs were readily available in cars. We certainly didn't have one. And they were playing a Mozart piano concerto. I don't even remember which one, but it was a lovely performance. And the window was open, and you could hear seagulls, which in Portland or anywhere near the ocean, of course, is ubiquitous. But here in Pittsburgh, we don't hear that. And I just remember right then thinking, this is exactly what this piece of music should sound like. It should have traffic noise in the background, although to be honest, that wasn't registering. Of course it's there, and it's always there when you're listening to music in a car, but I wasn't listening to that. What was pinging, what was registering, was this bird sound. And that was the manifestation of the piece. That was the music. I could go on with and I'm sure you have similar things as well. I mean, this is what music is. It ties into an experience around it. And all I would say is that there's something deliberate about being aware of that triggers in and allows you to extract the aesthetic. All right, so those of you who stuck with me, thank you. Of course, always, if you have questions or suggestions or comments, add them in the comment bit below, because I do read those and I do appreciate hearing. Or you can email me, zenglop@gmail.com. Although, to be honest, those of you who have been watching this and commenting know my personal email address, because you all love me and have been watching it. So, polyrhythm and rhythmic pedals. Okay. There's a couple of terms to talk about first, like what does Messiaen mean by polyrhythm? He's going to describe what he means by pedals and those kinds of things. But I want to talk about polyrhythm because I think it's a term that gets used to mean different things. And Messiaen is using it in a particular way here that may not actually be the way that you're thinking of polyrhythm. So let's start. The superposition of several complicated rhythms will often make it necessary for us in the course of this chapter to gather our rhythms into one meter. Okay, so we need to go back a little bit here. So before we talk about what polyrhythm means to Messiaen, and what it means generally in musical analysis, because the two are slightly different. Messiaen is using it, I think, in a more basic, simple way than what we sometimes use it to mean when we're talking about polyrhythm in music. But before we do that, the very beginning of the chapter, Messiaen is interested in the notation of rhythm. And in fact, chapter 7, which we'll talk about in the next video, is all about notation of rhythm. But he introduces the idea here, and I think the way to think about it is, for Messiaen, notation is gathering rhythms. He uses that word several times, to gather the rhythms and then present it in a way that can be played. But there's some difficulty in that, and he begins by saying, the superposition of several complicated rhythms will often make it necessary for us in the course of this chapter to gather our rhythms into one meter. Now, this troubles Messiaen because the meter contradicts his intention as the composer, right? He considers meter ametrical. He is not interested in ordered groupings of 4/4 measures. He's interested in ametricality. Remember, we talked about that in the first episode. The idea that there's a small pulse that is then captured and grouped into different patterns, some of which can be retrograded, some of which are non-retrograded, some of which are augmented, diminished, right? But it at the center of it is this pulse. Now, for to articulate that on a musical score, sometimes you need to use a time signature. Not always, and in fact, in many of the examples that we'll see, Messiaen avoids time signatures. He says, as a parenthesis in this paragraph, he actually says, this notation has the fault of being in contradiction to the rhythmic conception of the composer. We shall return to this subject in chapter 7, but certain examples cannot be written otherwise. Certain examples, he says, right? So here's his explanation. This is a direct quote. It is a question by means of syncopes of writing in a normal meter rhythms which have no relation to it. Okay. Now, when he uses the word syncope, we should hear syncopation. Except the whole point of syncopation is that you're hearing the beat and then like a Scott Joplin rag of some kind, that the accent is off the beat. But the whole point of what Messiaen is saying is that there is no regular beat. The beat is ametrical. It could be a group of 5, followed by a group of 3, followed by a group of 7, then another group of 5. So the visual representation in 4/4 or 5/4 or 7/6 or whatever it is counter to what he's trying to do. But you need to so you write it with syncope. A syncope is a unit of syncopation. It says, by multiplying the indications of slurs, dynamics, accents exactly where we want them, the effect of our music will be produced upon the auditor. The effect of it, but the notation contradicts that affect because it's written in a meter. For the comprehension of the reader before the measured examples and notating it as has been conceived, I shall write separately each rhythm destined to be superposed afterwards on one or several others. So he's giving us some heads up that in the example section we'll see short, unmetered examples, and then and then we'll see the full section that's written out in the meter, because it is logically necessary sometimes for the performance to see the meter, but we need to see the underlying rhythmic metrical patterns. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the word syncope, because it struck me as an unusual word and an interesting translation. So I looked it up. One other use of the word syncope. Right? So first, it can mean a displacement of an accent or a beat. So that's obviously the use that's in play here. But a syncope is also used to refer to a temporary loss of consciousness. Interesting. A syncope, is that like a fugue state? It's interesting that we have these musical terms that appear to describe these liminal mental states. It also, a syncope in grammar, refers to the omission of sounds from a word improperly. So, for example, the word probably, pronounced probably, library, pronounced library, or in the States here, I think a very common one, nuclear, pronounced nuclear, nuclear. So there's is that really grammar, or is that more syntax or linguistics? But the dropping of syllables within a word without losing the meaning of that word is also called a syncope. So how do we create polyrhythms, and what are they? Right. So when I saw the title polyrhythm, there's a tendency, I think, to think of polyrhythm and irrational rhythms as the same thing. So irrational rhythm would be where the pulse of one rhythm is different from the pulse of the other. So 3 against 2, where the unit, the single unit, is in one case divided into 3 and in another against 2. Right? Like that. Or 4 against 3, or 7 against 5, or in more complicated rhythmic notations, you get into things like 17 against 8, or it can be in a single part. Think of some of those romantic flourishes even in Chopin, where you have septuplets, or 10 notes, 13 notes, representing a freer breakdown of the pulse, than in 20th century music, where that's very precisely notated. I've been looking at some Raja sessions recently, and the notation of the irrational rhythms is actually too difficult for me to figure out. I've kind of set that aside and been playing Debussy instead. But that's one way of looking at polyrhythm, breaking out of the unit in different pulses, and when it's 2 parts, like the example I played, 3 against 2 or 7 against 5, then you get those sort of complicated beating patterns that I think we think of mostly when we think of polyrhythm. With Messiaen, he really is talking about metrical units. It's very unusual to see in these examples where the polyrhythm is created by writing different pulses. They're created by taking a rhythmic pattern, a metrical unit, and then modifying that pattern in some way and placing it in counterpoint to it. So that's what I mean. In some ways, Messiaen's definition of polyrhythm is a bit more straightforward than some other uses of the word that we run into when we look at other music contemporary to this, right? Think about Boulez and Stockhausen, who were writing in the same time in the 40s and 50s, building up very complicated methods of rhythmic notation. So to create polyrhythms, Messiaen really refers back to the different techniques that we've talked about modifying a rhythmic pattern. and if you remember, you can take a pattern and modify it by adding a dot to one of the rhythms, by inserting a rhythm. You can modify it by augmenting, meaning multiplying each of the rhythms by the same amount. So maybe if you have 3 quarter notes, it could move to 3 dotted quarter notes. Or if you had quarter note, eighth note, quarter note, and multiplied it by a fourth, then you would have, or by a half maybe would be a little bit easier, then you would have a quarter note tied to an eighth note. The eighth note would be tied to a 16th, and then the quarter tied to another eighth. You understand, right? And then diminution is the reverse of that. We spent a lot of time talking about that in the previous episode. So taking those techniques, and then with the original, with the other one underneath it. So let's go through all of them. The first technique for creating polyrhythm: superposition of rhythms of unequal length. Okay. So here's how Messiaen puts it. All the rhythmic forms detailed in the preceding chapters are constantly mixed in practice. It is also interesting to superpose them, and we arrive thus at a rather thorough polyrhythm. Our first essay in polyrhythm, the simplest, the most childish, will be the superposition of 2 rhythms of unequal length, repeated until the return of the combination of departure. And that's a key point. If you have 2 rhythmic patterns, 2 metrical patterns of different lengths, they start, and then you can imagine they gradually shift, and then at a certain point they come back and they're realigned at the starting point. The example that Messiaen provides in example 35, you have the lower staff has 9 16th notes, and the upper staff has a total of 10 16th notes. So then it requires 9 repetitions of the upper rhythm and 10 repetitions of the lower rhythm to find that original combination of departure. So to play these, the right hand, right, so the 10 notes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You see, and that's repeated. And then the left hand, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 9. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And if we put those together, just play through one cycle. One cycle. Then if I continue, right, so before the last beat of the 10 pulses of the upper staff becomes the first beat of the ninth. I know I'm belaboring this, but it's a really important idea of these overlapping patterns. So that's the superposition of 2 rhythmic patterns that aren't necessarily related to each other. The other techniques start with a pattern and then manipulate that pattern somehow and superpose the 2 together. I want to go back to the idea of the combination of departure, because to me that's part of this experience, right? Sometimes the patterns that are present in the music feel like that combination of departure could be 100 years from now if that pattern were allowed to continue, or longer. a million years from now? What is it to listen to a section of a piece of music, and at some level we feel this overlapping relationship, but we also feel that the duration of it extends beyond our lifespan? How do we interact with it? What additional emotions are conjured up by that realization, that extraction from the music? It confronts us with our mortality. And we are aware of that. Our bodies understand duration and patterns and beat. So, all right, so we superposed rhythms of unequal length. Fair enough. Now, next examples. Superposition of a rhythm upon its different form of augmentation. So in example 40, we're given a basic rhythm, a quarter, an eighth, and a quarter. Now, augmentation and diminution we talked a lot about in previous chapters, but it's basically multiplication and division. So if you look at example 41, the first measure, everything is divided by 2. The second measure, everything is multiplied by 2. And that that's then repeated a few times. A few measures in, you can see that everything is multiplied by a half again, right? So the quarter becomes the dotted quarter, the eighth becomes the dotted eighth, and that's what gives us an example 41, the pattern. Now, in 42, so Messiaen has made the decision to group this into 5/8 because he's hearing the eighth note as the pulse. It's also the sensible time signature for the first example, the quarter, the eighth, the quarter. You know, your 5/8 notes right there. So then he takes the example 40 and just repeats it, and then plays 41 over it. Now he's written this in a time signature, but there's no clef. But I do want to play through it. You know, he writes this in 5/8, but he doesn't put a key signature. There's no key signature, and there's actually no clef. Right? Now you could imagine that this would be, this is material. This is the framework, and the melodic and harmonic material would fit into it, would evolve with its own criteria and logic, just like the first example where we had the organ piece played on the piano. So I was wondering how to play this, because I do want to give this example. I want us to hear it, because you've got that very simple first rhythm and then quite a complicated set of changes on top of it. And originally I was going to just read it as a clef. I was going to assume it was a treble clef and bang it away in fifths on the piano. But then I remembered that we talked about Cage earlier, right? One of my favorite John Cage pieces is The Wonderful Widow of 17 Summers, which is a song, a text from Finnegan's Wake. And the pianist doesn't actually play the keys. The score is for kind of wonderful, using the soundboard of the piano to create these echoing different percussive timbres. Not even really percussive, right? Because there's gentle percussive sounds, but it's quite a lovely piece. So I thought I would play through this pattern on the piano as a little homage to Cage. I thought that was delightful. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. Next, number 3. So that was number 2, superposition of a rhythm upon its different forms of augmentation and diminution. The first was 2 rhythms, 2 meters of different length. The third, superposition of a rhythm upon its retrograde. Now, we know that Messiaen considers retrogradability and non-retrogradability to be one of the unifying characteristics of the musical experience. And he begins by saying, there is much to be said about this example, example 43. Now this one will be quite difficult to play. I'm going to give it a shot, but you can see it's got 3 staves. When he talks about this, Messiaen likes this example because it's also good for the different modes of transposition, which he doesn't talk about for a few more chapters. In terms of rhythm, so I'll give a shot playing through this example 43. Bien modéré, quite moderately, I'm going to play a très largo. And I'll only play the first couple of lines. See, the rhythm of the right hand in 16th notes is 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 1 3, and the rhythm of the left hand is, which you will notice is the retrograde. Now, when you hear me play it, you'll hear the left hand is offset by an 8th note. So they don't start at the same time, and the left hand is the retrograde of the right hand. The third staff, which is the bass on the organ, it would be the feet, the pedals, has its own non-retrogradable rhythm. So the hands are playing a retrogradable rhythm against itself, and the bass is playing a non-retrograde rhythm. Again, this is not just dry articulation of terminology. The apperception of these relationships really comes through, particularly when you hear the whole piece. I'm going to demonstrate it on the piano, but if you imagine these cycles extending for their full duration, your body, your heartbeat, entrains to this on some level. So let's give this a shot. So Messiaen describes as saying there are 3 rhythms which are repeated indefatigably in ostinato. It's the principle of the rhythmic pedal. And here we are in the presence of 3 superposed rhythmic pedals, the second being the retrograde of the first, and the third being non-retrogradable. All right, I have to take a little break there, get some tea. Those of you who have stuck it out this far, I appreciate it. While I was making my tea, I was talking to my wife. I'm having ongoing questions about my beard. You know, with everything closed down, barbershops have opened up, but they won't do beards because you have to wear a face mask. And I dyed it. I dyed my hair at the start of the quarantine. I thought it'd be great to have a big orange beard, and it was kind of cool. But now I'm sort of done, and I want it to fade, and I want it to be shaped properly. So I've been posing this question to people. Now my wife was able to braid it and it's a little short, but you know, but I could see how a braided effect could be a useful thing to have in my beard repertoire, and then that would allow me to do something as it grows out longer. I thought maybe this length would be a good goal. But a number of people, when asked this question, said, well, why don't you just cut it off? So what do you all think? Those of you who have sat through, I don't know, at this point, half an hour, depends how the editing's going, of me banging away on different rhythmic ostinati. I'll take your word. Let's see what people say in the comments about cutting my beard off. All right, so there's a few more different polyrhythmic techniques, right? Let's just review what we've done so far. We talked about the superposition of rhythms of unequal length, which is a very generic superset in some ways, right? Then we talked about superposition of a rhythm upon its different forms of augmentation and diminution. So you take the original and you create a pattern out of its augmentation and diminution, and then you keep the one steady while the other changes. Played over its retrograde. In the example that we saw, we had a rhythm, its retrograde, and then in the pedal, a non-retrogradable rhythm. So the next technique for creating polyrhythms is a rhythmic canon. So melodic canon, we're all familiar with things like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, Frere Jacques, where the melody, the second part of the melody is in harmony with the first part. And you can introduce the voice, multiple voices along the way. You sing it, you build up, and then you wrap down. You can do the same with rhythm, with or without melody. You know, the melody could be non-canonical, while the rhythm is canonical, or the melody could be following some other pattern of melodic development. Again, we'll get into that in later chapters when Messiaen focuses on the techniques of modes of transposition and the melodic use of those modes. But the idea of a rhythmic canon, you can again apply the different techniques of metrical manipulation to the canon. So the most straightforward one would be a rhythm, and then at some point the second voice comes in with exactly the same rhythm, and they just cluck along like that. And I suppose you could have in 3 parts, 4 parts, as many parts as you can muster up, and then they just keep going like that. As opposed to the other versions that have this idea of a point of departure. In the canon, the point of departure is the beginning, and the end is the end. There isn't, it doesn't have necessarily that cyclical feeling of a gradual in and out of phase. It's constantly the same distance in time. So that would be the most basic example, where you've got the rhythm in voice 1 and 2 is the same, and that's actually the example I'll play is that. Messiaen does give some written out metrical examples, but not musical examples of other types of canons. So for example, you could have the original beat and then its augmentation. So you could have a canon at the augmentation, a canon at the diminution, and that's actually a very classic form of canon. It's called the mensuration or temporal canon, and the piece that comes to mind when I think about that is Arvo Pärt's Benjamin Britten Memoriam, the Canticle in Memoriam, where you really just have this enormous scalar descent gesture that kicks off in the strings in different frequencies until at the end they all finally end up on the low, whatever it is, E, whatever the pitch is. But they come in and each entrance is a proportion of the one prior, so that then at the end the most rapid one starts, and they all end at the same time. So a rhythmic canon, the one I'm going to play is example 50. And he describes 50 this way. The upper staff, the right hand repeats a melodic and harmonic succession of 6 chords. The lower staff, the left hand repeats a melodic and harmonic succession of 5 chords, the whole entirely independent of the rhythmic canon established between the 2 hands at a quarter note's distance. So the couple of elements there, right? Going backwards, the distance that they enter can change. In this case, it's starting at a quarter note, but there's no reason why it couldn't start closer or further away. And they are a canon at the metrical unison. But then he's very clear that the melodic harmonic content is a totally separate pattern from that. You've got a 6 against 5 pattern that's going along in terms of the harmony. Again, you get this this entraining pattern that our body resonates with, even if we're not entirely aware of it. This idea of a repeating pattern like this that still has this consistent shape under the canon. It's quite an interesting. Of all of the examples we've talked about so far, this one really resonates with me. The idea of the metrical unison of the canon with a harmonic shifting on the top I like that idea. I won't play the examples of the canon by the addition of the dot canon of non-retrogradable rhythms, but think of it as that mensural canon. Think of it as the relationship extending out in a linear way, as opposed to the other forms of ostinato where you've got more of a sort of a cyclic, like clocking over of each other. All right, so I started off by talking about why Messiaen does this kind of manipulation. Like, why, when he applies these techniques, what is he trying to do? We talked in the last episode about his belief that the articulation of unitary experiences around non-retrogradable rhythm, modes of limited transposition, created sort of a pebble that could be dropped into the musical medium that generated ripples of experience, and that following those ripples, following that experience, would bring the listener into contemplation of the divine or of the spiritual. For Messiaen, of course, very much Catholic liturgy. For people like me who aren't Catholic, still can be transported into contemplation of a broad experience that is beyond the language of speech, hence the necessity of composers writing it down. The idea of canon and of superposition of patterns to create polyrhythms, I think the important part there is not the immediate interest of the polyrhythm, although that is certainly captivating. What is most interesting, I think, then, is the idea that these are patterns that start, and in order to return back to that initial starting point, some duration of time needs to take place. And it could be a matter of minutes, or, like I mentioned earlier, it could be the idea that these intersecting patterns to return back to their starting point could take longer than a human lifespan. And this introduces the idea of a vector of scale, a vector of duration. Now, this is not something Messiaen writes about explicitly, but I think it's something that he has in mind, that when the human scale that exists within the duration of an expected lifespan, with a number of annual cycles, daily cycles, breath cycles, nervous cycles, twitches. There's a full spectrum of activity that starts with our heartbeat, extends down into the physiology of the nervous system, and then extends out into our awareness of the circadian rhythms of the Earth around us, and ultimately of the planets and the galaxies. Those rhythms that are on the upward side of it intersect our bodies, but they are bigger than our bodies. And we spend a lot of time, I think, not thinking about those rhythms. And when we are confronted with those rhythms, we are confronted with the reality of our own mortality and what lies beyond that, what lies before that, what lies within it. These are all questions that are prompted by that confrontation with a vector of duration. Duration is one of the vectors of scale. The others are amplitude, distance, frequency. There are a couple of basic components of what it is to be a human embodied in a body that implies a certain scale. And anything that extends beyond that, either to the very, very big extreme or to the very, very small. It's interesting to think of music. So these patterns within Messiaen suggest durations that extend beyond our lifetime, are allotted whenever it is, fourscore, whatever we expect to get nowadays. But there's an interesting compositional element of duration that is so short that we can barely hear it, which is a very different aesthetic, very electronic aesthetic, for example, with glitch music, where you get the sense that the articulations that you're hearing in the music are this sort of surface froth on a subatomic process. In some ways, the inverse, but it's like a figure eight, or a Venn diagram, where the human body is the center of the intersecting vectors of duration, size, distance, things like that. So I remember reading a book called The Tuning of the World by R. Murray Schafer. A fantastic book about the physical connection of sound and the landscape. And in that book, he quotes Thomas Mann. And I'm going to read the quotation. So this is a third hand removed, right? It's Thomas Mann quoted in R. Murray Schafer's Tuning of the World, now referenced in these videos. But here's the quote. Day after day, one walks along the strand, listening to the indolent splashing of the wavelets, gauging the gradual crescendo to the heavier treading and on to the organized warfare of the breakers. The mind must be slowed to catch the million transformations of the water, on sand, on shale, against driftwood, against the seawall. Every drop tinkles at a different pitch. Each wave sets a different filtering on an inexhaustible supply of white noise. Some sounds are discrete, others continuous. In the sea, the two fuse in primordial unity. The rhythms of the sea are many. Infrabiological, for the water changes pitch and timbre faster than the ear's resolving power to catch its changes. Biological, the waves rhyme with the patterns of heart and lung, and the tides with night and day, and suprabiological, the eternal, inextinguishable presence of water. That's so fantastic, and I think that the polyrhythmic patterns in Messiaen's music sort of bring that suprabiological into the biological, and then back up again. The Thomas Mann section ends with the ocean, but only in the same way that Messiaen ends with the music. It ends with the music and then begins with the music. The same way that it ends with the ocean, but then begins and goes beyond that. All right, I just spent the last long time trying to figure out how to do the multiple takes on the melodic here, and I think I've got it. I'm going to go down now. I've got 2 different tracks of sound, 2 different video tracks, and I need to lay them all in. That a cappella app didn't work for me. I'm not sure what was going on. The mics it didn't work. So I'm going to try and do this in iMovie, which is really stretching my videography skills. But if it sounds like what it sounded like as I was recording it, it's quite nice. And I thought I would show you what. So here's the score from last week. So what I wanted to do then was take this melody, which is sort of based on this quite nice harmony that I've written out here, and all of the melody is based on that. And I thought what I would do is take the rhythm of the first measure. This 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, and make that the second voice. And I would use pitches that I'm not using in that chord. So here's the nice chord. Well, I'm not using G sharp and A sharp. So that's where I got the material from. I made the decision I'm going to continue to not use time signatures. The bar lines that I've got in here actually represent the shape of the melody as I augmented the rhythm in the previous episodes, and I quite like that. So I kept that, and I used the right. So I kept that, and I just added in the second line. On the original, on this first page here, there are a couple of mistakes that I marked with X's. They were copying mistakes from the previous week. I've kept those, and I've also introduced a whole new line of mistakes, because when I do this, I do it quickly and quite thoughtlessly. Certainly not with the care that it deserves. So as I was playing through, I noticed that I had misaligned it. So there are some unintended augmentation at the dot, a couple of additional values thrown in there. The end result of it is all, I think, perfectly appropriate, and I'm not going to sweat it. If I tried for perfection, I would fail. So this is etude now in 2 voices.